Certainly. Here's the first part of your horror story inspired by the theme True Dark Web Horror Stories Animated, Scary Reddit Stories, for YouTube. Sam had always been a curious soul, perhaps too curious for his own good. Working as a cybersecurity expert, he thought he knew the ins and outs of the internet. Yet, there was one area he had meticulously avoided until now: the dark web. The dark web was infamous, a hidden layer of the internet, a haven for the most sinister of human activities. Sam's curiosity, however, finally got the better of him on a dreary Thursday night. With the storm outside mirroring his internal tumult, he booted up his old laptop, one he specifically kept disconnected from his real identity, and began his descent into the unknown. As he navigated through layers of security and anonymity, Sam found himself in a chat room that claimed to share true horror stories. These weren't your average ghost tales, but stories that had supposedly happened to members of this very forum. Intrigued and somewhat skeptical, Sam scrolled through the narratives of disappearances, hauntings, and inexplicable events. It was then that a new post caught his eye. It was titled, "The Midnight Game, Real-Life Experience." The user, Dark Watcher, detailed an experience about playing a supposed game that summoned a creature from another dimension. The rules were simple yet eerie. At exactly midnight, one must knock on their front door 22 times, with the final knock occurring precisely when the clock struck 12. A candle had to be lit immediately afterward, and the words "I welcome you" had to be spoken into the darkness. What followed was a game of cat and mouse with an entity known as the Midnight Man. If your candle went out, you had 10 seconds to relight it or encircle yourself with a ring of salt to survive until 3:33 a.m. Laughing it off as nothing but an elaborate joke, Sam's fingers were already typing his skeptical reply when a private message popped up from Dark Watcher. "Don't dismiss it until you try it, Sam. It's not just a story." Chills ran down his spine. How did this person know his real name? He hadn't used it when registering. His rational mind urged him to shut everything down, but his curiosity was piqued. He needed to know if this was real. That night, as the clock neared midnight, Sam decided to try the game. With each knock on his door, a sense of dread filled the air. By the 22nd knock, his hands were shaking. The candle was lit, the words spoken into the void of his dark living room. The silence that followed was deafening. The flame of the candle flickered gently as if teasing his fears. Minutes passed, or at least what felt like minutes in the thick silence. Then, a soft noise, a whisper of movement, sounded from the kitchen. Sam held his breath, trying to dismiss it as the house settling. But then, his candle flickered violently and went out. Panic surged as he fumbled with his lighter, his hands trembling so much that he barely managed to relight the candle within the 10-second limit. The game had just become terrifyingly real. He roamed his house, candle in hand, heart pounding in his chest. Every shadow seemed to move, every slight noise a potential sign of the Midnight Man. Time became a blur until he found himself checking his watch, which ominously read 3:32 a.m. Just one more minute and it would be over. As the seconds ticked by, Sam felt a growing sense of dread. He was about to sigh in relief when he heard a loud crash from his study. Heart in his throat, he approached the room only to stop dead in his tracks at the threshold. The room was in chaos, books strewn about, his desk overturned. And on the wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "It's not over." Suddenly, the air turned icy cold, and the candle flickered out again. Frantically, Sam reached for his pocket of salt, but before he could spill a single grain, everything went black. In the pitch darkness, Sam's heart raced as an oppressive silence filled the room. His fingers closed around the salt, but it was too late. He could feel the presence of something else in the room with him. It was a sensation of pure malice, a shadow that seemed to suck the warmth from the air around him. Desperate, Sam tried to remember the layout of his house as he stumbled forward, hoping to escape the room. He barely made it to the hallway when he felt a cold hand brush against his back. Spinning around, he found nothing but the dark, empty corridor. His mind raced, thoughts fragmented by fear. Each step felt heavier than the last, his breath short and sharp in the quiet house. Determined to survive until 3:33 a.m., Sam clenched the lighter and the salt tightly in his hands. He moved through the hallway, guided only by the weak, trembling light of his relit candle. The shadows on the walls danced menacingly, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to watch him as he passed. The ticking of the clock in the living room was a grim reminder that time was both his enemy and his only ally. As the candle flickered once more, a whisper echoed down the corridor, "It's not just a game." The voice was neither male nor female but something inhuman. Sam's skin crawled as the whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. He rushed to the living room, the center of his home, and formed a circle of salt around himself. Sitting in the middle, Sam watched as the candlelight struggled against the darkness that pressed in on all sides. The air grew colder, and he could see his breath forming misty clouds in the candlelight. Outside, the storm had intensified, its howls merging with the creaks and moans of the house. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking the windows, and for a moment, the reality of the storm outside seemed to battle the nightmare within. Sam's watch vibrated lightly against his wrist, 3:33 a.m. Relief washed over him for a brief moment until he realized the oppressive presence did not diminish with the passing of the designated time. The candle went out again, plunging him into darkness. The air was thick with a sense of impending dread. Sam fumbled for his lighter, but it was gone. His fingers brushed something else in his pocket, something he didn't remember putting there, a small, crumpled piece of paper. Straining his eyes in the darkness, he tried to read the words written in a hurried, jagged scrawl, "The game never ends." Before he could process the message, a loud bang echoed through the house, as if every door had slammed shut at once. The ground beneath him felt like it was vibrating, or perhaps it was just his body trembling uncontrollably. Sam knew he had to leave the circle of salt for the sake of light and sanity, but fear rooted him to the spot. Every story he had ever heard about the dark web, every whispered rumor about its darkest corners, came flooding back to him. He was living a nightmare, and the boundary between his digital explorations and this palpable terror had blurred irreversibly. Suddenly, a chilling gale swept through the room, dispersing the circle of salt as if mocking his feeble attempt at protection. Sam scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide open in the darkness, trying to adjust to the lack of light. Just then, a small, barely perceptible glow appeared in the hallway, another candle, but not one he had lit. Driven by a mix of terror and desperate hope, Sam followed the light. Each step took him deeper into his own home, which now felt like a labyrinth designed by his darkest fears. The walls seemed to pulse with a sinister life of their own, the shadows whispering secrets in a language too terrible to understand. He reached out to touch the wall, needing the assurance of something solid, but what he felt was not the cool, familiar plaster of his home. It was soft, almost organic, and it pulsed under his touch. Recoiling in horror, Sam realized that the house itself was changing, adapting to the game, or perhaps it was revealing what it had always hidden beneath its mundane surface. The candle ahead flickered as if beckoning him to follow deeper into the unknown, into the heart of his fears. With each step, the stories of the dark web, once read with detached fascination, wove themselves into the fabric of his reality, each tale a thread in the tapestry of this nightmare. As Sam followed the flickering candle through the morphing corridors of his own house, a sense of disorientation overwhelmed him. The walls seemed to undulate subtly with each flash of lightning that penetrated the dense fabric of the storm outside, creating grotesque shadows that danced along the hallway. He could hear a faint dripping sound, rhythmic and steady, but there was no indication of where it was coming from. The house felt alive, its every creak and groan a whisper of secrets too dark for the light of day. The air grew colder as he moved closer to the light. It was almost as if he was walking into a freezer, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. His breath became visible, mingling with the thickening fog inside his home. The candle that guided him seemed to burn with an unnatural flame, blue and low, barely illuminating the path ahead. It was leading him, or perhaps luring him, to something unknown and terrifying. Sam reached what should have been the living room, but the door opened to a completely different scene. He stepped into a vast, dimly lit library that he had never seen before. The shelves were towering, filled with ancient, leather-bound books whose titles shimmered in the candlelight with an eerie glow. The room was circular, with a domed ceiling that depicted a night sky filled with swirling galaxies and nebulous clouds. It was as if he had stepped out of his house and into another realm. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate desk. On it, another candle burned beside an open book. The pages were yellowed with age, the writing on them an elegant but indecipherable script that twisted and seemed to move as he tried to focus on it. Compelled by an unknown force, Sam approached the desk and looked down at the book. As he did, the words stopped moving and formed a clear message: "Play continues beyond the veil of midnight." A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candle beside the book and plunging the room into darkness. Sam's heart raced as he heard the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps approaching. He spun around, straining his eyes to penetrate the darkness that now enveloped him. There was nothing but the sound of his own breath and the approaching steps. Then, just as suddenly as it had been extinguished, the candle on the desk relit itself, casting a ghastly illumination over the figure now standing on the other side of the room. It was a tall, thin man, dressed in a tattered black robe that seemed to blend into the shadows. His face was obscured by a hood, but where his eyes should have been, there were only deep, empty sockets that stared back at Sam. "You've come further than most," the figure spoke, his voice a dry, hollow whisper that echoed off the walls. "But the game is far from over." Sam tried to respond, to demand answers, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure moved closer, gliding rather than walking, his presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. "This is not just your game," the figure continued, gesturing to the book on the desk. "It is the game of every soul brave or foolish enough to seek the shadows. And the shadows are hungry." Without warning, the room shifted. The shelves of books began to spin, blurring into a whirlwind of leather and paper. The dome above cracked open, revealing not the stormy sky Sam expected, but a void so dark and endless that it seemed to pull at his very soul. The figure in black reached across the desk, offering Sam a quill. "Write your fears," it commanded. "Feed the game." Sam's hand moved almost against his will, grasping the quill. As he dipped it into an inkwell that had appeared on the desk, the ink swirled with a life of its own, glowing faintly red. He touched the tip to the page, and the moment he did, the room stilled. The book absorbed his written words, and with each letter, the shadows around him grew denser, more oppressive. Fear gripped him as he realized that with every fear he wrote down, he was not just playing the game, he was fueling it, allowing it to grow stronger. But he couldn't stop. The compulsion to write was overpowering, each word a confession of his deepest anxieties and nightmares. As the book filled, the figure watched, its sockets seeming to burn with a cold fire. "The game never ends," it whispered, a smirk playing on its shadowy lips. "It only evolves." The realization dawned on Sam that he was no longer just a participant in this dark game but a part of its very fabric, woven into its endless cycle of fear and darkness. With each word he wrote, he felt himself slipping further away from the reality he knew and deeper into the abyss that the dark web had opened before him. The figure seemed to grow taller, its form more menacing as the room expanded and contracted like a living entity. The walls of the library pulsed with a rhythmic heartbeat, syncing with Sam's own accelerating pulse. Each book on the vast shelves whispered secrets as he passed, their voices melding into a cacophony of murmurs that filled the air with an ominous resonance. The figure led him deeper into the library, through a maze of shelves that seemed to rearrange themselves with each step they took. The path you walk is paved with the fears of those who played before you, the figure intoned. Its voice was a symphony of despair that resonated deep within Sam's bones. Each story here is a lost soul, ensnared by the game they could not finish. Sam's mind raced as he tried to understand his role in this macabre scenario. He was no longer sure if he was navigating the library or if the library was navigating him, leading him to an end he could not foresee. The candlelight flickered, casting long shadows that writhed and twisted around his feet, as if trying to whisper their own tales of woe. Every now and then, a book would fall from the shelf, landing open on the floor. The pages, illuminated by the dim candlelight, revealed horrifying images, faces contorted in terror, landscapes desolate and barren, creatures with eyes that seemed to follow his every move. Each page turned on its own, as if an unseen hand guided him through a gallery of nightmares. "This is your gallery now," the figure spoke, stopping before a grand, arched doorway that had not been there a moment earlier. "Your fears, once written, become part of the eternal game. Look upon what you have created." Sam approached the doorway with trepidation. Through the arch, he could see scenes playing out like scenes from a movie, each one more terrifying than the last. One showed a child cowering in the corner of a dark room as shadows converged upon him. Another depicted a woman running through a forest, glancing back at some unseen pursuer. Each scene was a manifestation of the fears he had written in the book, brought to life in horrifying detail. "You see, the game feeds on fear, it grows, it evolves, and it never ends," the figure continued. Its cloak seemed to absorb the light, making it appear as a void against the shifting backgrounds of the archway. "Your fear has given it new life, new stories to tell. And in return, it will give you immortality of a sort." Sam felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the implication of the figure's words. Immortality in this context meant an eternal haunting within these pages, a never-ending loop of fear and dread. He watched as the scenes in the archway shifted, each one a twisted reflection of his deepest anxieties. "But why me? Why did it choose me?" Sam's voice was barely a whisper, drowned out by the rustling of the pages around him. "It chose you because you sought it out," the figure replied, its voice a cold whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You delved into the dark web, into the forbidden corners of the world, driven by curiosity and a desire to understand. That desire is what the game feeds on, it lures those who seek, those who wonder, those who fear." As the realization sank in, Sam felt a sense of inevitability envelop him. He had been a willing participant, drawn to the shadows by his own volition. Now, he was part of the game, another story in its endless collection. The figure gestured to the book still on the desk. "Continue writing, Sam. Write your fears, your hopes, your desires. Every word feeds the game, and the game in turn gives your fears life. This is your legacy." With a sense of despair, Sam approached the book again. The quill felt heavy in his hand, each stroke a permanent mark in the annals of this shadowy world. As he wrote, the scenes in the archway grew more vivid, more terrifying. He was creating a universe of horror with each word, each sentence a thread in the fabric of this nightmare. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, the library was a universe unto itself, with its own laws, its own horrors. Sam wrote, driven by a force he could no longer resist, his story intertwining with those of countless others who had wandered into the dark web, never to return. And as he wrote, the library expanded, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows danced with glee. For the game was alive, fed by the fears of those who dared to play, and it was far from over. Each word Sam wrote spiraled into the depths of the game's heart, each page a testament to the dark allure that had captured him. The figure watched, its eye sockets deep and empty, yet somehow filled with an ancient, terrible wisdom. Sam felt the figure's gaze pierce through him as he wrote, each word a chain binding him to this endless library of terror. As the clock outside the bounds of this warped reality continued its inexorable march, the scenes in the archway grew even more intense. A young girl, her eyes wide with terror, scrambled through a narrow alley, her breath forming quicksilver clouds in the icy air. A man, his face gaunt with dread, peered through a cracked door into a room where shadows pulsed and writhed like living things. The horror that Sam wrote into existence wasn't just visual, it was palpable. He could feel the fear of his characters, a fear that mirrored his own. It fed back into the room, a cyclical storm of terror that grew with every heartbeat. The figure spoke again, its voice a rasping echo that seemed to come from the very walls of the library. "You have done well, Sam. The stories are vibrant with fear. But remember, every story must have its climax, its moment of ultimate terror." Sam's hand trembled as he lifted the quill once more. He knew what he had to write, the scene that would encapsulate all the horror he had felt and created. He began to craft the final entry, his hand moving as if of its own accord. In this last scene, he wrote of himself, sitting in the haunted library, surrounded by the countless books of those who had played the game before him. The room was silent now, save for the sound of his quill scratching across the page. As he wrote, the shadows in the corners of the room grew thicker, coalescing into forms both grotesque and familiar. Faces of those he had imagined into his stories, their eyes hollow with despair, their mouths open in silent screams. The candle beside him flickered one last time and then went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. A cold wind whipped through the library, pages fluttering like the wings of night birds. The whispers of the books grew louder, a chorus of the damned that filled the air with their lament. And then, from the darkness, the figure approached. It stood over Sam, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "The story is complete," it hissed, its breath cold as the grave. "But fear not, for this is not the end. It is merely your beginning." With those words, the library began to dissolve around Sam. The walls, the books, the candlelight, all faded into a void darker than anything he had ever known. He was left floating in an abyss, his only company the stories he had written, now alive and writhing around him. They whispered to him, tales of horror and madness that he had birthed from his own fears. As the realization of his fate dawned on him, a new kind of terror took hold. Sam had become part of his own story, a living entity within the game he had sought to understand. He was both the author and the subject, the creator and the creation. And in the dark, where no light could reach, the game continued. The figure's final words echoed in the endless void, a chilling promise that this horror, this nightmare labyrinth of fear, was eternal. "You are now the heart of the game, Sam. Write in fear, for every story needs its teller." And with that, Sam's screams merged with those of his characters, a symphony of terror without end, echoing through the darkness of a realm where the game never dies, and the storyteller is forever bound to the tales of horror they have woven.